So that's what's happening in the war zone. Let's just zoom out now and go to the Apulia region in Italy. That's where the leaders of the G7 countries are meeting for their annual summit. G7 is short for Group of Seven. It is an informal grouping of industrialized democracies, namely the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK. The European Union also participates in all the discussions. It is represented by presidents of the European Council and the European Commission. The G7 meets every year to discuss issues concerning the economy, geopolitics, global security. There is no doubt that the war in Ukraine would be high on the agenda. After all, the G7 members, most of whom are also part of the NATO, have been the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. But then here's the big question. Does the G7 have a solid plan for Ukraine? The bloc claims it does. The plan is to use frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine defense. In fact, the US has come up with this idea. You see, when the war started, the G7, along with the European Union, froze Russian assets worth $325 billion. What do you do with these assets? International law does not allow these countries to confiscate Russian assets, and so they've found loopholes. What the G7 is planning to do now, essentially, is to give money to Ukraine in loans by using the interest on Russian assets. You get the plan? And through this scheme, the G7 members will be basically able to give around $50 billion to Ukraine. 50 billion. This money will be dispersed through multiple channels, and it will go towards Ukraine's military, budget, and the country's reconstruction work. Now, apart from this, G7 leaders are also expected to make separate announcements. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will reportedly be announcing up to $309 million towards Ukraine's energy and humanitarian needs. US President Joe Biden is expected to sign a security agreement with Ukraine. Through this agreement, Washington will commit to supply military assistance to Kiev for 10 long years. And what do you think explains this long timeline? In one word, fear. Here's a question. What happens if former US President Donald Trump wins the November election? Will he continue to support Ukraine? And here's another question. Does this agreement that Biden is signing with his Ukrainian counterpart really guarantee all-weather support for Kiev? No, it does not. You see, this is an agreement, not a treaty. The US Congress will not be ratifying or giving a formal consent to this commitment, which essentially means that over the next 10 years, any future president can choose to walk out of this agreement. Which then brings me back to the question, does the G7 really have a solid plan? Even after the $50 billion loan is signed, what stops Russia from escalating its offensive? From sending more missiles and drones to strike Ukraine? How many of you know that Russia once belonged to the Forum? G7 was G8, but in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Soon, it was thrown out of the bloc. And that, by the way, did not stop Russia from waging a full-blown war on Ukraine. We just showed you how Russia is striking deep into Ukraine. Zelensky's hometown has been hit. Russian President Putin is also threatening to punish countries that are arming Ukraine with long-range missiles. We also have visuals of the Russian warship and nuclear submarine in Cuba. Let's play them out for you. This is Russia sending a message to Ukraine's allies as they shake hands in Italy's Apulia. This is where the region is on the map. Puglia is in the southern peninsular part of Italy. Before the Greeks came to Apulia, the region used to be inhabited by the Lapygians or the Apulians. Over various periods in history, Puglia was ruled by ancient Romans, the Byzantines, the Aragonese and the Spanish. Puglia is home to golden beaches, crystal clear water, picturesque landscape and delicious food. As the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni hosts the G7 leaders there in Puglia, her government will ensure that no stone is left unturned as far as their hospitality is concerned. Also, you must know that leaders from a whole host of other countries outside the G7 are also attending that summit. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is flying down to Puglia. Ukraine's Zelensky is also in Puglia, as are leaders from Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, the UAE, Kenya, Algeria, Tunisia. This is where the leaders are meeting, the Borgo Egnazia Luxury Resort. It is midway between Brindisi and Bari. The five-star resort has 6 restaurants. One of them has a Michelin. There's also a spa and multiple swimming pools. The resort is built in Puglian style using white yellow stones. The rooms here have pure white walls, low lightings. The rooms here also cost around $1,400 a night. Meaning, if you want to stay here, you will have to shell out a minimum of $1,10,000 per night just on room rent. But if you can afford this luxury, then you will be treated like a king. Candles will line every passage. Every night, a large pot of rose petals and salt will be left in your room for your baths, to forget your worries, or de-stress after a day of negotiations on how best to stop Russia's war on Ukraine. This is Massimo Bottura. He is a 3-star Michelin chef, and he will be hosting the leaders in the luxury resort in Puglia. Bottura plans to serve them the ultimate comfort food, and his signature dish, the crunchy part of the lasagna. Also on the menu is beef from Piedmont, cooked with truffles and Barolo wine, Sardinian lobster, risotto, Venetian fish, soup with streamed crab, clams, mussels, shrimp, tomato-flavored ice cream. There is someone who will be missing out on the delicious menu, though. The Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He will be skipping the G7 summit because he will be overseeing the works of the Hajj season. But as rest of the leaders gather in Italy and talk about the war in Ukraine, there is a report that says less than 3% of the G7 military spending could help end global hunger and solve the global South debt crisis. Oxfam International's head of inequality policy, Max Lawson, said, and I'm quoting here, "Governments are finding their pockets run deep to fund war today. But when it comes to stopping starvation, they are suddenly broke. We are talking about a small commitment with the potential for huge impact. Imagine a world where no one goes to bed hungry, and where countries in the global south can put money into public schools and hospitals instead of debt interest payments. The G7 not only has the means, but the moral and strategic imperative to make this happen," quote unquote. And Lawson is right. The G7, after all, has the means, but the big question is, does it have the will? To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.